Hello everyone and welcome back for yet another episode of the Off Grid podcast. Pleasure to have you back. We go again, we keep it going. I'm enjoying this ride. This week's episode, very exciting one. I'm joined by Mr. Mark Beaumont. Now Mark is the fastest person to cycle around the world, which he did in 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes, averaging 240 miles a day. He cycled around the world twice. He cycled the length of Africa. He's rode oceans. He's also biked down one of the highest active volcanoes on Earth. So a very interesting conversation indeed. In this conversation, we talk about the importance of being alone, what it means to suffer well, agency and how to lead in our own lives, the need for recognition from others, and a near fatal capsize on the Atlantic Ocean. If you guys love this conversation, you can watch Around the World in 80 Days on Amazon Prime now. Hope you guys love the podcast. Let's do this thing. On with the podcast. Mark, welcome to the Off Grid podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
How are you getting on? You all right?
Yeah, we're not exactly off grid here. We're right in the middle of Piccadilly, Mayfair, wherever we are. But this is definitely not off grid. You can probably hear drills and hammering in the background as they rebuild London.
Oh yeah. I mean, we found probably like the most natural spot in London, which consists of 3G turf and fake flowers. So here we are in the outback. Mark, where I wanted to start with you is that you recommend young people to go off their phone, head into nature for a whole day and have no noise in their life, to spend time alone for a day. Why do you think that is important?
I was fortunate to grow up homeschooled until I was into high school. I'm 42, so I was of a generation that didn't have mobiles. We're not just living in a sort of a digital age now in terms of your computers in your pocket, but we're constantly comparing ourselves to others. There's that connectivity at all times. And I'm fortunate that my career has been a media career. So I've very much relied on storytelling and communication. But I started my career shooting documentaries with the BBC, where you got to live the adventure and then tell the story afterwards. And then social media and real-time storytelling has become a bigger thing as my career has gone on. And I've watched that evolution of storytelling with interest. Now, I realize that the generation coming up behind me, it's digital first. It's almost like build your brand, tell your story before you've actually done anything. And I guess the reason I think this is important is to really remember your why. Why are you doing this to begin with? There's no harm in monetizing your adventures. There's no harm in doing these things professionally. And if you want to associate yourself with brands and do that, great. But when you're doing hard stuff in the outdoors, when you're pushing yourself in adventures, the first priority is the privilege of being out in those spaces, the want to be there yourself, the want to create memories that last a lifetime. They aren't just sort of things that you share. And I think that sort of core why as to connection to Wow Place, what it does for your own health and happiness. If you then want to layer on top a digital world and tell the world, fantastic. But I worry that if you start with Instagram and TikTok and then try and sort of find the adventure within that, then you sort of miss the wider sort of raison d'etre for it. So as I say, I've got no qualms or issues with, people taking social media and mobile phones, on their adventures. But I think the foundational pillar for adventure should be your experience in that place, which you then, once you found that happiness and experienced it fully, want to layer on top the digital world, great. But doing it the other way around can sometimes sort of miss the whole point to begin with. I think we all know that, but it's sometimes hard to disentangle ourselves from the digital world.
Yeah, this kind of constant need to kind of make it public, to get the followers for it, to maybe even monetize for it. Otherwise, people perhaps struggle to see the point of doing it in the first place.
Yeah, that's definitely a very sad point. I had the absolute privilege of interviewing Helen Renard a few days ago for the Endurance Pod, and Helen is somebody who smashed the winter Monroe round, so 282 Monroes. For most people, that's a life's, I was going to say work, a life mission. To do it nonstop is unbelievable. To do it in the winter, only 5 people in history have ever done that. And Helen last winter smashed the all-time record, 81 days for 282 Monroes. And for those who don't know what a Monroe is, any mountain in Scotland over 3,000 foot. The day before she went to do it, she didn't even tell her climbing partners. She was out ice climbing with her buddies like Dave McLeod and other legends in the business. She didn't even tell her parents. So she went out and smashed the winter round of the Monroes and told nobody. She's got an Instagram account and she has 0 followers. Now that's an extreme. That's an extreme. But I've got so much respect for people who are adventure first. Adventure first. No issues if you monetize it. I've been an ambassador for lots of brands over the years. And the thing that I always sort of talk about when it comes to affiliations is it's great to do that, but earn your stripes first. Earn your stripes first. It shouldn't be build a brand and then build your credibility. Build your credibility and then talk about it, because there's a real risk that your value is your followers. No, your values is your credibility in that place. If you're going to do thought leadership about climbing or cycling or adventure, go and do hard stuff. Go and do hard stuff and then have the platform to be able to talk credibly about it, as opposed to the validation simply being the amount of likes. Likes are such a strange currency for credibility.
Yeah, this kind of new currency of popularity that, like, if you've got more likes, somehow you become better or improved in competition that would be in that particular area
Yeah,
that
I
you're
think I
doing.
think it's so important to pass it on to, hopefully. I mean, I'm not a coach, but I love the idea through podcasts like yours of giving people the quiet confidence to get out there and push their boundaries. So I will never take people away from communication. Communicate, communicate. But ultimately, sport, adventure, it's a community thing if you can do it with friends, but ultimately it's a very selfish thing, and so it should be. We're egocentric to the point that do stuff that looks after your physical health and your mental health. Get out there, spend time in the great outdoors, do stuff that's life affirming, career defining, do stuff which is wonderfully for you. If you can create externalities from that and create value for others because you're out there pushing yourself and inspiring others, fantastic. But it starts from you being the best version of yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what adventure is. You're in the outdoors, you're appreciating the wild spaces, you're taking yourself on adventures, you're doing it because it matters to you. If you can share that with your friends, all the better. If you can share those stories and it inspires others, even better. Those are the ripples that it comes from this, but it starts from you wanting to push yourself in the great outdoors.
And what's interesting about what you've been doing is a lot of it is it's you against you. Yeah, it's like this solo feat of endurance. And I think for a lot of people, they're probably wondering, like, what is it when you're going through these, when you're in the thick of it and you're in the heat of the endurance? What is the self talk like? What's going through your mind at that point?
You're absolutely right about the point about the only person I've ever really been racing is myself. People assume because my career has been firsts and fastest, then it's been, about beating others. Um, I guess because I was homeschooled, I was never, in the rugby team or in the football team. That wasn't a thing. I was riding ponies, skiing, cycling. I was very much sort of out on the farm. The only person I was really sort of pushing was myself. It's always been that sort of intrinsic motivation. And so when people say things like, what there's 3 people next year trying to go for my round the world record. Well, what do you think about that, Mark? Fantastic. I don't lose interest, but I sort of lose track of, where my records are and, what the stakes are, because it really, it doesn't take away from what I've done. In fact, it amplifies it. It's a huge compliment when people go for these records. So how do I motivate myself? Which was the question. Um, yeah, the only person I'm ever racing is myself. Holding yourself to account as to what you believe is possible. If anyone's followed my career, I've never tried to pip somebody else's record. I've always gone out there, said out loud, claimed the target that I'm aiming for, and then driven towards that. So let's take the most obvious one. I still hold the round the world record, 18,000 miles, 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. The previous record holder was Andrew Nicholson, an Olympian from New Zealand. His time was 123 days. No disrespect to Andrew, but I never thought twice about the 123 days. You can't be trying to break 123 and go sub 80. If you believe you can be the first human being to get around planet Earth under your own steam in that Victorian fiction, that 80 days, that Phileas Fogg mission, that's got to be your everything. So when I sat on the red sofa, BBC Breakfast, and told the world we were going to go sub 80, no disrespect to Andrew, but I wasn't trying to break his record. I was trying to go sub 80. And holding yourself to account around that target and allowing the world to dream with you, telling the world that this is what we're going to do. Imagine you could do the first sub 80. That power of the dream and allowing people to live that with you is amazing. I mean, not just in terms of like the media engagement, but just, it really holds you to account. It's not like you're training hard and then getting out there to the race and going, let's figure out what's possible. I've already figured out what's possible before I start. And then it's just about working the plan.
Putting yourself out there, saying that you're going to achieve something that is seemingly impossible to the whole world, that feels like a risk.
Well, the word impossible simply means it's not been done before. Impossible means there's no reference point for what you're talking about. Now, clearly things are impossible if they're stupid and unreferenced. But everything I've ever done in my career is very, very well thought through and planned. So it might be a paper exercise, it might be a theory, but it's a very well rationalized hypothesis. It's not like I'm just sort of going, well, let's see what happens. The last record I broke in anger was the North Coast 500 record. So that's, for me, quite short, 500 miles, big race around the top of Scotland. Robbie, the guy who had the record before me, was the national 24-hour time trial champion. And he said to me ahead of time, he said, "You're not going to break my record." He wasn't being arrogant about it. He just thought, I've had the race of my life. I left it all out there. I'm the national 24-hour champ. And he said I could, and because he raced his best race and had been through that, I get it. If somebody used to break my record, I'm the first to congratulate them because I know how deep they've gone. I think you're in the privileged position of truly understanding what it took to do that. And so, Robbie's time on the North Coast 500 was 29 hours and 5 minutes for 518 miles over 10,000 meters of ascent. And we figured out very, very carefully how you could do it in 28 hours, 30 minutes. And then we did it in 28 hours, 34 minutes. The 4 minutes were the bloody traffic lights in Inverness. I'll blame them. But my point is, I knew if I rode 270 watts normalized power for 28 and a half hours, that's what I would come home in. We'd premeditated it. We'd owned it. Having that clarity on what you're going to do stops the emotions coming into it. It stops when you're out there going, well, I feel terrible, so I'll do less, or I feel great, so let's do more. None of that. Just ruthless consistency.
And you speak about this idea of being able to suffer well. What do you mean by that?
Well, like you, and take this as a compliment, I'm a big guy. I'm 6'3", I'm nearly 100 kilos. If I had a pound for every time somebody said to me, "Oh, you're a big lad for a pro bike rider," and yeah, I am. But my superpower, if I have one, it's not. If anyone, there's better bike riders within a square block of where we're sitting in London right now. I'm not the best bike rider. The reason I've broken the round the world record twice, length of Africa, lots of other stuff, is consistency. Is absolute sort of ultra endurance consistency. So how much of that is physiology, not injuring, nutrition, and how much of that is psychology? So my ability to suffer well is, I think, I'm quite good at coming up with a plan with my amazing team and committing to it. But ultimately, you need to think your way through the task. So, the record that stands for the circumnavigation, that's 1,100 hours of time trialing. 1,100 hours. You're on the bike at 4 o'clock every morning. You're racing 16 hours a day, averaging 240 miles a day every single day for 2.5 months. So I think lots of people could ride at 240. What's that, 385 kilometers? I think if you had to, you could do that. Could you do it tomorrow? Could you do it next week? Could you do it next month? Can you do it every day for 2.5 months? That ability to suffer well, you got to think your way through the task. And because I've been doing this since I was a kid, I was 12 when I pedaled across Scotland. I've been a student of endurance since I was a child. And I think, the psychology to be able to think your way through that is something you learn. There's riders who are fitter, faster, stronger, better. But I've done very few races. I've always been out there doing expeditions and records attempts. But when I have done a few odd races, I do stand on the start line and look around me at these little whippers and these, incredible athletes and go, okay, you might beat me at midday, but I think I can beat you at midnight. How good are you at 2 o'clock in the morning when it's pissing with rain? And I think, there's a real sort of mischief around that. There's a real mischief to know that whether it's true or not, you believe you can outsuffer people.
There's clearly like a drive in you, isn't there? There's like a "I'll show you" type attitude.
But I don't think I'm trying to show other people. I think I think you've got to go back to my sort of homeschooling and isolation. It's ironic that I spend my life in the public eye, doing events and television because, I was a homeschool kid. So I'm very happy for months of my life on my own, not speaking to anyone. And I was never that kid in the playground. Y- You know, I I was the politics of the playground, and I think a lot of what we learn as adults comes from our childhood. So because I was never sort of really trying to prove myself in a sporting context, I do think, and it goes back to your very first question, that intrinsic motivation to every year I want to be able to punctuate time. I want to do stuff which is interesting. Hopefully not just to myself, but my family and those that care most. That's my community. That's my tribe. That's my clan. Um, so the fact that along the way, other people are saying, well, you're comparatively this, that, and the next thing is not a motivating factor. That drive for me has always been a real sort of intrinsic drive rather than external validation. Of course, external validation matters when you're building a business and, you're being commercial about these things. But for me, and it goes back to that first point, I've got two daughters, Harriet and Willow. They're 12 and 9. And, it's something I chat quite a lot to them about, es- especially in sort of this world of constantly looking for external validation. Understand the process, not the results. I'm often asked, would you allow your daughters to do what you've done in your career? And I think my answer to that would be by the time they're old enough to have these bold ideas, might be sport, might be other things. I hope that I've had enough shared experiences with them that they understand the scale of what they're taking on. So they don't just see, the accolade, but they get to see the work. And the works, the people often say to me things like, Mark, I would love to do what you do. And I say, I think you like the idea of what I do because you get to see the greatest hits and the results and the edited outtakes. I think the process is often quite different and I enjoy it, but it's not a bunch of roses. It's not the easy street, uh, when my dad sort of jokingly says, Mark, when are you going to get a job? It's to have had a 20-year career doing adventure, television, corporate investments, doing the stuff that I do. It's incredibly entrepreneurial. It's very high risk. I don't think it is everyone's idea of fun. So, yeah, that drive is real. Of course, it's real, and I think it shows up in different people in different ways.
Yeah, I think going back to that point of like being able to put in the work in the background, this idea that people aren't actually seeing the work it takes to get to that finish line or to get to the big achievement or world
Yeah.
record, whatever you're doing, is almost people don't see it whatsoever. I mean, maybe more so now with social media and stuff where you can do, daily vlogs and letting people know what you're up to, but they never really know. They don't know the commitment. They don't know what you're sacrificing. Have you read the book Man's Search for Meaning by
No,
Viktor Frankl?
no.
He was in Auschwitz, and he put out a book when he came out discussing this idea of how do you find meaning in a time where your suffering is all around you. And he says that suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
No, yeah. There's obviously a lot of wisdom in that. Yeah.
What is it in your suffering that you find purpose in?
So I think it would be very, very hard to hold yourself to account on these big record attempts if you didn't have absolute clarity on what you'd committed to doing. If it was simply a case of training hard, getting out there, and then finding out how good you were, I think it would be very hard to hit your best possible number. the fact that you've premeditated it, the fact that you've owned it, the fact that you've said it out loud, whether it's the 80 days or whatever else, I think that higher accountability around this is what I believe is possible. You owe it to yourself and to your amazing team around you. When I did the Around the World in 80 Days, I had 40 people working on that project for 2.5 years. It wasn't just one guy on a push bike. So my amazing family and team and everyone in logistics, performance and media working on it, they'd all bought into that dream. That was the purpose. I wasn't going to turn around to them and say, oh, actually, I don't feel like it today. Or, 100 days is good enough or 120 days is good enough because that will still break the record. I owed it to them. I owed it to myself. It was something we bought into collectively. And it comes back to that very simple idea of it's very hard to do better than what you set out to do. Targets are incredibly self-limiting. So it's why you need to get the strategy right as opposed to just leaving it up to the process. I see it so often. I mean, I spend quite a lot of my time working with entrepreneurs and founders, especially around climate change, environmental sustainability. And you might have the best technology in the world, the best IP, but ultimately time is the real sort of accountability step. And that's what I've worked with my entire life. Like, what are you going to do when, and how are you going to deliver that, and who's going to buy into it? And I'm fascinated in that concept in terms of, what you say, what you believe, and how that drives your behaviors. Because people just sort of think that it's a combination of sort of luck and hard work. And for sure, those factors play in. But ultimately, it's normally just around, are you fundamentally doing the thing that shifts the dial? What are you doing that really gets you to where you're going to get to? Human beings have an amazing ability to distract themselves and work on stuff which means they're busy but not relevant. And the wonderful thing about sport and adventure sports is there's no lying. I've often heard it said, you can lie in business, you can lie in love, you can't lie in sport. You're either doing it or you're not. So I mean, I've seen it. You see it in business all the time. You can fake it because you can say, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And well, the company might be, but are you? Are you in the room? Are you actually doing it? In relationships as well. Whereas, the wonderful thing about sport is there's a wonderful, simple clarity around it. You're either climbing that mountain or you're not. You can't spin it. You can't tell a story about what you did or didn't do. You either did it or you didn't do it. And I often, with entrepreneurs, try and drive that singularity and that clarity where there's no spin, there's no story of what you did, there's no version of the truths. It's like you're either doing it or you're not.
This concept of agency, how does that fit into what you're talking about?
Agency for sort of the main actors or for the team around you? How do you?
You've spoken about this idea of agency in your life, being able to sort of be the pilot, taking yourself where you want to go, and being sort of single-minded in the way that you're setting your goals and holding yourself accountable. How does that play a role in your life?
I'm patron for Entrepreneurial Scotland, which gives 400 or 500 young people a year in Scotland the opportunity to do work experience. And why do I do that? I'm really passionate, especially with young people, to give them the quiet confidence to back their own ideas. So our education system is great in many ways, but ultimately it's quite formulaic. Our education system teaches us to remember stuff, which will become less relevant in a world where all knowledge is at our fingertips, although it's still good to be able to remember and know stuff and have reference points, and problem solve. So if education is simply the ability for you to be a big memory drive and to problem solve, then who are you? And I think especially in the AI world, we need to sort of think about, well, our value is who we are, not our ability to remember and solve stuff. So a great late friend of mine, David Pete, said to me a long time ago, be valued because of who you are, not because of what you do. Most people define themselves by their job title, and that's a technical skill set. But your value is, do you look up, look out? Do you support others? Can you be relevant under pressure? Do you have a network where you can spot value and Can you communicate effectively? Can you, are you kind? Whatever those value sets are, and skill sets are beyond sort of a technical skill set. Um, so the switch that I try and create, to your point around agency, is how do you get, I was going to say young people because that's important for the next generation. How do you give young people the quiet confidence, and it is quiet confidence, it's not arrogance, to have the agency to back their own ideas? The superpower in life is not how good you are at maths or how much history you can remember, but the superpower is, can you stand on your own 2 feet and back your own ideas? Do you feel like you're in the driving seat for your own career? And the more that you can encourage that, that doesn't mean you have to be a lone wolf. That doesn't mean you have to, set up your own business and be an entrepreneur. But regardless of what you do in life, do you have the quiet confidence to back your own ideas? Because that, if I was to give my kids one thing in life, it would be that. Because I think the idea of education just being your value for others in problem solving and knowledge is so limiting, especially when you then broaden it out to your own mental health and happiness. Are you really just your ability to fix stuff, or actually are are you showing up as more than just sort of the bot version of yourself? And I think also when it comes to sort of hard choices in life, what are you going to do? Not waiting for other people to open those doors for you, having the quiet confidence to say, well, even though everyone's going that way, I've got an idea that, happiness is in this direction for me for these good reasons. And we grow up in this sort of teacher pupil mindset where we wait for people to sort of validate our ideas. Wouldn't it be amazing if we didn't need that? Wouldn't it be amazing? For sure, surround yourself with people who can support you. Nobody does things truly on their own. But if you've got an idea, pursue it, explore it. It might not work, but how are you going to learn from it? And so that's the bit about agency for me. Have the conviction of your ideas and surround yourself by people who love and support you.
It's one of those things where, and I completely agree, having that instilled within you that you want to go and pursue your dream, your ideas, it's fantastic. But it almost feels like resistance with the real world. The real world, it tells you what to do, what to learn. Go make sure you get a good education, make sure you get a degree, grad role, etc., mortgage, marriage, throughout someone's entire lifespan.
Yeah.
How do you actually on an individual level get to that point? Because there'll be people who are listening to this now thinking, oh, I've got this idea, I've had it for a year, 2 years, but something within them stopping them from going and doing that thing. What would you say to that person?
Okay, so I would say a couple of quick things. One, what do they say? Comparison is the thing that sort of kills contentment, because if you're constantly sort of looking at others and thinking they've made it and you've not, then that fundamentally squashes your own sense of self-belief and happiness. So don't look at me or listen to me and think, wow, oh my goodness, that guy's got it sorted.
Mm.
There is no steady state. You don't get to a point in life where there's a big unlock, wealth, profile, family, whatever you value as success to be. And you don't get to that and go, right, I'm going to hit pause now. Because trust me, if you hit pause in life, that's a sure sign that you're going to be pretty unhappy. Human beings are at their best when they're striving. We're at our best when we've got a sense of responsibility for more than just ourselves. When we're looking up, looking out, helping others, that's that builds sort of community. You've probably heard me say before, if you're having a bad day, send arrows out into the world. Send arrows, out to your friends, your colleagues, the world around you, because those arrows come straight back at you, and they anchor you in terms of your own purpose. So if anyone's sort of listening to this, don't be intimidated or confounded by this idea that other people have got it sorted. Everyone's figuring it out. They might be at different points on different journeys, but just be your authentic self. And the other thing is that the hardest thing also always with a plan is just, you've got the idea of what the result looks like, that big idea, but it can be quite hard to figure out what the process looks like. So people obsess with, what does my 80 days, like, what does that look like? But that's not where you start. The behavior is not 80 days. The behavior, when people say to me things like, I'm going to start a business or row the Atlantic or whatever it might be, I all say, great. But does your lived experience, your day to day, relate to that? Because if it does, great, and you're already working towards it. But if it doesn't, then you've got one of two things you could change your goal or change your behavior. So I think where people become fundamentally unhappy is that there's a confusion between their life goals and their behaviors. So they'll say, I want to cycle around the world, but in actual fact, the most they're ever doing is cycling around Richmond Park. And, you know, at some point along the road, the massive void between that sort of lived reality and that goal just becomes deeply unsettling. It's like, well, which version of myself is true? And you've got to do something. You've got to do something to learn your trade, to step up, to understand the process, not just the results. And I think the unhappiness only comes when you spend a long period of your time where there's a massive void between how you see yourself and the reality of the life that you're leading. So just either change the goals or change the behaviors, but don't live in that sort of awkward void where the sort of the way you see yourself is a million miles from what you're actually doing each day. There's always something you can do, and focus on the lived bit. Focus on, don't if it's completely unrealistic to, be a tech entrepreneur scaling the next unicorn. If that's actually not the life you're leading because you can't take that level of entrepreneurial risk, put it to bed. I've put loads of ideas to bed in my life, big stuff that drove me for years that I thought was going to be my next big thing. And then for very good reason, I sort of one day said, I'm never going to do that. And that's okay. And you've not failed. I had the idea of being the first person to race around the planet in its entirety, oceans and continents. How fast can I get from this point all the way around? That drove me for 5 years. Can you imagine doing the continents by bike and the Atlantic, the Indian, the Pacific Ocean? Nobody's ever done it. It drove me for 5 years. And during that time, I thought, if I ever don't do that, I'm going to have failed. And then for very good reason, I got to the point where I one day said, I'm never going to do that. And do you know the relief I felt? I'm like, it's so good to have been driven by that dream. That dream has allowed me to do lots of interesting stuff along the way, but life's moved on and now I've got a different idea and that's okay.
So you've got this dream, your mind's set on it, is driving you for 5 years. And then what changed?
Well, that one in particular, again, we were sort of speaking more broadly, but that one in particular, I didn't enjoy ocean rowing as much as I thought I would. The reason I love endurance cycling and climbing and other sports is the fact that your effort propels you through the landscape. Whether it's through the Arctic, high altitude mountaineering, cycling, every day changes. It's your relationship with being off the grid, with being in wild places. I found ocean rowing quite monotonous. I'm sure mariners will disagree on this point, but if you want a journey that's just about your own thoughts, row an ocean, because out there it's big waves, little waves. I mean, the clouds change a wee bit, but there's no that you lose that sense of earning the change. Like if I get through the next couple of days, I'm out the desert and I'm into the mountains. There's none of that. So I found ocean rowing. It didn't give me what I look for in adventure in the same way as endurance cycling or running or other things. And then we also capsized in the Atlantic and nearly died. Spent 14 hours paddling around trying not to drown. And so I came back from that, got married, and I've got different responsibilities. Even if I did enjoy it, which I didn't particularly, there's no way I would put my wife through that again. It's not just about me. And so, priorities are allowed to change. But did I learn a lot from that? Hell yeah. I mean, it was amazing. But to put a big dream to bed, the last 6 years I've been building a venture firm, an investment firm focused on healthcare and environmental sustainability. Hugely proud of that. Amazing team. Love what we do. And the next chapter, I'll focus on more in that space, but take those ideas and again support entrepreneurs in a different way. I'm really, really keen that I can sort of take my energy and my time and try and build these projects of scale, whether it's in sports, in media, in business. Um, I think the mistake that some people make is they get stuck. They sort of have an idea and they want to be over there, but they're stuck over here, and you've got to move. You've got to move. If it's not working for whatever reason, health, happiness, wealth, whatever that defines as, move, make the hard decision. Because as an adult, people don't make those decisions for you. As children, if you need to put your jacket on before you go outside, your mum and dad tell you. But, as adults, if things aren't working, then move, make that decision yourself. And I think maybe it goes back to your question about agency. It's giving people the habit of doing that. And I think, I would hate people to listen to this conversation and say, well, Mark has got it sorted. I don't, but I really enjoy the challenge of each year thinking, how can I create impact within the stuff that I care about? My family, my community, the charities I support, and the work that I do.
You talk about redefining success, and you say that there's a differentiation between I was there and I did.
Yeah.
And you related that in an earlier conversation you've had before to the capsize that you had in 2012 on the Atlantic. What happened out there, and what was that learning that you gained from it?
Yeah, I mean, we were trying to do the first sub 1 month crossing of the Atlantic, which has been done now, but back then was really seen as the 4-minute mile of ocean rowing to do the first sub 1 month crossing. We were in a triple scull, so 6 of us on board. Matt was the skipper. 3 of the rowers on board were top flight river rowers, so technically very good. 3 of us, I would say, were more sort of expedition hardened, but weren't technical river rowers. And we'd all been on the training, offshore survival. We all knew what to do in a Mayday situation. You can't go out there if you've not done that. But on day 28, when we capsized, we were writing a change of shift. So every 2 hours, we changed shift pattern. And because the hatch door was open as somebody came out, when the boat went over, and I was rowing at the time, the boat flooded, the stern cabin flooded, and the boat, rather than it self-righting, it stayed the wrong way up. And it took about 45 minutes to get everyone in the life raft. Those things that are a bit of fun and training in a wave pool and take 5 minutes. Time slows down when your life depends on it and you're actually out there for real, 500 miles offshore. And what was really noticeable was once we got everyone into the life raft, regardless of training or, seniority in the team, there was this seemed to be this unspoken assumption that certain people would do what was necessary. It'd never been spoken about, but when the shit hit the fan, only 2 of us got back into the water, did the swims, the dives, underneath into the flooded cabin spaces and salvaged the satellite phone, the EPIRBs, the flares, the kit that was needed to be rescued. And, without naming names, the river rowers, who were phenomenal athletes, didn't cope as well in the Mayday situation. They weren't relevant to the rescue. We all survived, but for whatever reason, they sort of allowed a few of us to sort of put that training into action, and so we would all tell you a story about survival. We would all talk about a day we nearly died, but what we were actually saying, what we were actually doing was markedly different. And I think that sort of success by association is something that, I always watch out for when I'm recruiting people, which is, this is the company I've kept, this is the things that I've done. And I'm always sort of asking more pointed questions in terms of, well, were you in the life raft or did you actually get out the life raft and do the work? And, I don't, I don't feel any sort of resentment or issue in terms of, it's a very, very scary, high stakes situation where, we very, very nearly didn't come back. And, people had their own individual reasons for coping or not coping. So that's not a criticism. It's just an observation on people's ability to stay relevant. And the thing I care most about in life is that behavioral change under pressure. do you still have the ability to operate effectively, when you turn the heat up?
Yeah, preparing and then the real thing are two different
Yeah,
things
yeah,
when
yeah,
it's
yeah.
high pressure and
Y-
you were there, and you experienced what that change was. And what did you do in that situation?
So the theory was, you get the grab bag, everything's there, you call the Mayday and sit tight. The reality was we were worried in very high seas. Well, it wasn't high seas, it was confused seas. So we had following currents with sort of side winds. So I would describe the seas like the top of a Christmas cake, sort of short, sharp chop, very confused seas as opposed to big swell. So we get thrown all over the place. And I was really worried that the riggers would puncture the life raft. So tethered a 50-meter line between the upturned vessel and the life raft. And once we got everyone into it, one of the chaps nearly drowned during the capsize. So we knew that he would be really depleted and probably wouldn't be able to help with what happened next. But still a good friend of mine, and he recovered well. In fact, went back to row the Atlantic again. Amazing guy. Um, Once we got everyone into the life raft, it was that very simple conversation. We are just waiting for a plane to come out and do grid search of the ocean. I mean, my mum and my wife didn't know whether we were alive or dead at that point. The Mayday had gone off, but we hadn't communicated beyond that. Um, so that the EPIRB had been set off, but that first EPIRB only shows where the Mayday happened. It doesn't track your drift.
Mm.
So you need to know where you are as opposed to where the accident happened. So we needed to get back across. All the kit that we needed was inside that flooded cabin space. So to get there, you got to dive down up into the shape of the boat. The highest point is now the footwell. If you imagine everything's the wrong way up, there's a small air pocket in there, and you're sort of in the dark space underneath. Every time the swell comes through, that closes out. And then you've got to sort of duck down, open your eyes in salt water, swim into, the cabin space and try and find satellite phone, VHF radio, flares, all the kit that's going to have you rescued. Because the idea of a plane flying out from Florida and do grid searches of the oceans, I mean, that's real needle in a haystack stuff. So we were alive, but we weren't going to survive unless we told people where we were and instigated that rescue. We got picked up by a Taiwanese cargo vessel that rerouted over 100 nautical miles to pick us up. So by the time the rescue happened, we salvaged the kit, got on the satellite phone, got the GPS tracked EPIRB, which shows where we were in real time rather than where the accident had happened. And eventually, this Taiwanese cargo vessel, 180-meter vessel with a 9-meter deck height, called the Nord Taipei, reached us. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, you've now got to get off a life raft, which is sort of the size of this table we're sitting next to, onto something the size of a football field. And, that's incredible. That's probably the most dangerous part after the actual capsize itself, where coming alongside this monster in the middle of the night, I mean, the first time around, it nearly flipped us, ran us over. And just to grab the lines that they were throwing down, pull yourself alongside, we're getting sort of violently dragged up and down the side of the hull in big seas. Well, and then getting everyone onto the rope ladder and climbing for your lives. Because some of the guys hadn't moved for 14 hours, they just sat in the life raft. We didn't know whether they would be able to climb themselves to rescue. So Matt and myself were the last two off the life raft. And, by that point, it was literally your life depends on getting up that rope ladder. Bizarre, it was a ship that was going from Venezuela to Egypt that had rerouted to rescue us. And we spent the next 10 days coming back across the Atlantic and got dropped off in Gibraltar. But I mean, I was dressed in their clothes. I got rescued in a pair of boxer shorts and a t-shirt. So, we didn't even have my clothes, didn't, passport. All our kit was with the boat that had capsized. And, we came home with our lives and a story to tell, but it was one thing sort of training for that. By the point that we were 2,500 miles into the crossing, we thought we'd done it. We thought we were into Caribbean water and we were sort of rowing ourselves to victory. And then that.
You've achieved so many big things, and you put yourself in these situations where there is that level of risk and there is that level of danger, and you seek it out. You seem to go for it. Like you cycle around the world twice, length of Africa. You've rode oceans. You've ridden a bike from the highest volcano down. You do all these big things. Why?
The your question about sort of you seek out danger. I don't think I do seek out danger. I mean, clearly when you're going off the grid and doing things in the great outdoors, then you've got to be. It can be high exposure. By that I mean, if things go wrong, the consequences can be quite significant. But I'm not an adrenaline junkie. It's not like I'm like climbing without ropes or jumping out planes. Like I don't look for that thrill. Um, I love pushing myself physically. I love pushing myself mentally, but I do like to be in control. And, I think actually the more high stakes, the more that you're actually trying to control that environment that you're in. Um, we live in an extraordinary world in terms of its culture and its geography. And, actually having had quite a sheltered upbringing, not traveling, not leaving the farm, it's an absolute privilege to now make a living exploring the world. And through doing that, not just filming it and pushing myself, most people fly to somewhere, see it for a week, and then fly home, and that's their holiday. To actually travel through places, to actually at the grassroots meet people, to experience things, to see how one thing becomes the next, to see the world by its similarities rather than its differences because you join it all up. Having been to 130 nations and territories, that is addictive. Why do I do it? That's why. It's magical. But with that comes a great privilege as well because I'm very conscious of my footprint, my privilege to be able to do these things. So what do I do? Um, I share it in a way which I hope is sort of credible and interesting. I don't know. It's very hard to track those effects, but having done this for 2 decades, that storytelling has definitely allowed other people to make changes in their lives, which is wonderful. Again, it's not the first reason you do it, but when you do this professionally, I think there is an obligation to share these stories in a way, because lots of people aren't going to get to do those things themselves. So you get the sort of the vicariously sharing important stories in a way that's interesting. But if it does help people in terms of their own priorities, fantastic. And then it comes to the actual investments. So, throughout my 20s and early 30s, I was out there pushing myself, adventuring the world over, seeing the world changing, and filming it and thinking, well, if I can share some of these stories, like rowing through the high Arctic and highlighting climate change, then that's enough. And then I got to a position in my 30s where I could actually put my money where my mouth was and actually start to, as an angel investor, back entrepreneurs that were relevant to the big issues of the day around microbead plastic pollution or overuse of chemicals in waters or, food and water security or sustainable agriculture, whatever it might be. And then I did that for a number of years. And then I thought, no, this isn't enough. I've gone from like observing to communicating to investing, but it's still quite small scale. How do I take it to the next level and try and put a spotlight on an ecosystem? And that's why in the last 5-6 years, I've helped an investment firm grow so we can scale more capital and more help to be relevant to the big issues of our day, especially around sort of global health issues and environmental sustainability. So I've been on this sort of 20-year journey to sort of push myself in the great outdoors, observe and communicate from the great outdoors, then have the opportunity to invest in people who can be relevant to sustainability, and then going, actually doing it myself isn't enough. How do I use my profile and platform to crowd in others who are interested in these conversations? The reason I'm in London today is because I'm going to the national emergency briefing tomorrow all around climate change. This is what I care about. And my privilege to go and explore and see firsthand, the amazing world that we live in comes with a responsibility to then drive change. And over the next 25 years, I plan to do that. Now, one person can't do that much, but if I can be a catalyst to crowd in human resource and, human interest and, focus and capital, fantastic. I would love that. Will I continue to do adventures and spend time in the great outdoors? Yes, of course. That's what keeps me going. I
Still a
love
part
that.
of
And
who you are.
I love spending time in the wilderness, with my daughters, with my family, with my dog. But then through doing that, the media and the event stuff, if I can drive interest around sustainability at large, be it human health or environmental sustainability, fantastic. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, that kind of drive to keep going and do things is clearly within you. That sort of, let's go one more yard, let's keep going. And you mentioned there you went back to your childhood, sort of having quite an insular homeschool upbringing, that sort of thing. And when you were 13, you'd cycled across Scotland, and you spoke about this lovely story coming back to school, and you got recognition, and people started realizing like, oh, this guy Mark, he's gone and done something cool. Do you think like that need for recognition has permeated throughout all your different achievements and life onwards?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. This has become a theme of this podcast, which I don't mind, but it's an interesting one that you've come back to. Whilst I have talked already about sort of the need to back your own ideas and having the quiet confidence to do that, we're social animals. Of course, we need validation. Whether it's from our parents, our peers, our partners, our work colleagues. Of course, unless you're a complete sort of narcissist, then, or what's the right word for somebody who doesn't care at all about validation?
Sociopath?
Sociopath. That's the one. Unless you're a complete sociopath, um, I think it's healthy to check in with the real world around you. I think it's healthy to give a shit and care. Of course it is. Um, can you get the balance right between backing your own ideas and, having people around you sort of care about and support your ambitions? So I think your identity, your work, your family, your community do fundamentally matter. When I was going into high school, I, there was two professional athletes from my year at school. Alistair Dickinson, who became a prop forward for Scotland, and myself. And I think most of my peers from school were incredibly surprised that I became an athlete, because I was that sort of farm boy who rode ponies and went skiing. And, it wasn't what school defined as sport, which was football and rugby. And so I think that's still to everyone's amazement. I think for myself and my friendship group, the fact that I was on this sort of parallel journey, I was 12 when I pedaled across Scotland, raising money for charity. I'll always remember at the age of 12 handing over a charity check for £2,000 to Princess Anne, Princess Royal. As a young boy, to meet Princess Royal and buy a horse trailer for the International League for the Protection of Horses, and as a 12-year-old being able to, help rescue ponies, and meet royalty. Of course, that had an impact on my life. Of course, it did. And Princess Anne has been, somebody who's popped up throughout my career. She now is a huge supporter of the My Name's Doddy Foundation, which every year I support a huge ride during the Six Nations with Rob Wainwright to take a match ball to one of the games. In March, we'll be going from Melrose to Dublin with about 300 others and raises over £1 million a year. A huge project that I'm very proud to be a part of. And I'm now 42, so that's 30 years on, and characters like Princess Anne have popped up throughout my career. And of course, having that interest in what I'm doing and driving, nobody's an island. And, the recognition from your peers and those around you, of course it matters. I think the question that I keep coming back to is, how do you drive your own ideas where that matters, but other people's expectations don't completely control your behaviors? I think it's the bit that I'm interested in. But I mean, high school for me was like most people, was a bit of a topsy-turvy period. When you're homeschooled, you've got quite a lot to learn. I didn't struggle academically. I did struggle socially. I was pretty socially inept when I got to high school. I think I would have bullied me at high school.
Yeah.
That's a joke. Don't bully. But I was primed to be picked on. I didn't know any of the politics of the playground, and I was definitely, pretty vulnerable when I turned up at high school. So I had a hell of a lot to learn.
It's interesting. There seems to be, obviously, you've chosen to do all these incredible challenges. There's clearly a strong driver within you, to do more, to not just travel, but to hit the world record, to be the fastest. Um, what do you think that is within you?
Um, I think that I've always been fascinated about this idea of sort of punctuating time. You know, if life was one long sentence, what are the punctuation marks? Like, how do you break that up? I don't want to just exist. I think if something scares me more than anything else, it's the idea of just the years blending into each other. I want each chapter to have a purpose. I want to, you know, not in a mad ego megalomaniac way, but I want to sort of leave a dent in the things that I care about. And so I think that's why everything that I've put my time to, I want to do with a level of sort of purpose. I want to sort of start by going, and this is what we're trying to create. Now, this conversation is very much focused around what I do and my interests, but my family, my mum, worked with me throughout my teenage years when I was an amateur, and then my professional career really until my mid 30s. I've had amazing teams working around me in sport, in media, in venture capital. I might have the profile from what I do, and I might be driving a lot of. I would always describe myself as the architect, not the builder. So I always rely on good builders who have the technical skill sets to deliver on the plan. I'm quite good at coming up with the big sort of the big idea. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. Now, what do we like? How do we resource that, and how do we build the house? And so, you come back to this idea of like what motivates you. I love the concept of creating a different future. I love the idea of being disruptive in a good way. I love the idea of sort of going, well, what's the problem statement? And, how can we address that? What's the opportunity? What's the flip side of that problem? Well, and so I think if you look at everything I've done in my career, whether it's in sport or media or in business, it's always like, how do you create a different future? How do you create a different future? And then to be the architect for that, and sure, I need to play my part, but my technical skill set within that is normally just one piece of the puzzle. But before you actually get busy with, delivering that change, you've got to have the plan. And the thing I love more than anything else is how to build the plan and resource the plan. So I know that's a bit sort of grandioso, but I think that's why I can sort of chunk my career up into chapters. I've never had a job. I've never been for a job interview. I've never written a CV. Like I'm not somebody who's gone out there and said, well, how can I've worked with lots of people. I've created lots of partnerships. I love trying to figure out what's valuable for different people. But I guess my approach has always been, you know, what's the problem statement? How do you get around the world quicker than anyone else before? What's possible? How do we build that? And, I often use the metaphor, let's build a bigger boat, let's use a bigger boat. And, how do you do that? And it's a lot of fun. I don't think it's everyone's idea of fun. I talked to my sister who's a midwife, and I talked to my other sister who's an educational psychologist, and it scares the hell out of them, the uncertainty that I live with. But I've got used to it because I've done it my whole life. So I could not do what either of them do. I mean, I cannot imagine the responsibility for working with kids that are, struggling in the education system or being a midwife. I mean, what my sisters do is phenomenal. I couldn't do that. But then they look at me and go, Mark, you literally don't know what next year looks like. And I couldn't live with the constant uncertainty. And I'm like, yeah, but the longer you do this, the more you're like, it's okay. Like, we'll create a project that works for everyone involved. That doesn't worry me anymore. But I mean, I'm not. It's interesting talking about this on a podcast. I'm not advocating that everyone does this. It works for me. It's the way I'm wired up. It's what I enjoy doing. But I also wouldn't want people to sit there and go, "Well, Mark's just on this sort of individual crusade." I'm not. I often get I'm very aware I've written 6 books, and I'm very conscious when I write those books that I'm writing the history for my team on behalf of my team. They don't have the profile to be the front person so I'm writing their history as well, which is a real responsibility, you can imagine. Whenever there's any points of contention in my stories, with my teams, I always go back to a very sort of factual, this is what happened. Other points, if you ever get to read my books, I'll be saying, I felt this, I thought that. And whenever it gets to any points of sort of high tension in the team, I just go back to it, and this is what happened, X, Y, and Z, because I think it's very, very unfair when you're working with these sort of high pressure, high performance teams to then use that profile to sort of write the history books for everyone involved. Because hell, if you're going to do hard stuff, you're going to have a few upsets along the way.
It's a big responsibility, you've being the one to tell the story at the
Yeah,
end of it
yeah.
all. And you've got a real sense of like, I've got this sense from you of like just a bit of a rebel, trying to flip the playbook, trying to find your way to do things. And it's incredibly exciting. So thanks a lot for sharing all your story and for coming onto the pod, Mark.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It fascinates me that we've not actually talked about expeditions that much. I love the way you've taken the conversation in a completely different direction.
Great. Glad you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it too. It's like, it's one of those things where when I do all the prep, at the end of it, I think, what am I really interested in? What one thing about this individual am I like so fascinated by? So yeah, just went for it today and yeah, absolutely loved it.
Good on you. Well done.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Cheers.